My favorite book, if you haven't figured it out by now, you're not paying attention, is The Lord of the Rings. And in The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship, on their very important quest, goes into the mines of Moria. If you were a nerd, you would know that the original name is Khazad-dûm, the Dwarf of the dwarves, but you don't need to know that. I know that, but that's just me. Of the 9 going into the mines, they're basically going from one side of this mountain to the other side through a series of tunnels that have been carved in ancient times. Only the wizard Gandalf had been in there before. And only once, and it had been years before. And only he had a staff that could yield light to show the way. Otherwise, they would have never been able to find their way in the darkness. But for Gandalf, this was a reluctant choice. They had wanted to go over the mountain, but the late snowstorms had nearly frozen them to death. So they had to go under the mountain. But he didn't want to go because he knew how uncertain the paths were, that there were unknown dangers here. But they had nowhere else to go, so he led them. Those of you who know the story, and it's really not a spoiler, it's more than 100 years old, know that Gandalf didn't make it out of the mines of Moria. He fell there, his premonition being accurate. Take that, I actually misspoke. It's not more than 100 years old. The Hobbit is, but anyway, you get the picture. Let's compare that this morning to Jesus leading the way to Jerusalem for his passion. Look at Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 34 is where we'll be this morning. Starting with verse 32, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. This is the third and final time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus has predicted his death. This time, he offers more detail than before, and we will see that as we go. At this point in the narrative, he and his followers are already making the climb to their destination. They have already begun the uphill journey to Jerusalem, to the holy city. I don't know who normally led the group when they traveled from place to place. When they were in Judea and Galilee, they didn't need guides. They knew where they were going. They weren't afraid of banditry because they had a large group. I don't know who normally led the way. Was it Peter? Was he the one out front? Was it somebody else, the guy with the longest legs who was impatient? I don't know who was in front of their group normally. But here and now, Jesus is out front. And Mark found that thought to be significant enough to highlight it for us. In Luke's gospel, we read that already, Luke emphasized that Jesus' attitude as he led them toward Jerusalem was resolute. So why is Jesus leading from the front? Why is he resolute? Why is he intent upon this journey? Well, we can speculate. Neither author gives us reasons. Firstly, we know that Jesus knows with certainty what lies ahead. He actually knows what will happen when he gets to Jerusalem. He's going to predict it here in a moment. Secondly, despite that knowledge of what is to come, and it is a dismal future, Jesus is firmly and fully committed to this path. This is his path, and he is committed to it. And then lastly, perhaps he is leading to show his embrace of his Father's will, his confidence in the ultimate outcome. Because in the end, that's probably the heart of this moment, and that is trust. Trust in his Father. Trust in the will of the Father. Sufficient trust on Jesus' part that he is leading the way to Jerusalem. Let's look at those who follow him. And the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Neither the disciples nor the others following Jesus could match his attitude. Mark doesn't tell us why the disciples are astonished, but it seems fairly likely that they are amazed how boldly Jesus is advancing towards his own death. He's already told them twice before, when we get to Jerusalem, I will die. And yet he is out front leading. We tend to romanticize those who bravely stare down death in the face and go forward anyway. Perhaps you're aware of Tennyson's famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, where 600 go forward against the Russian cannons, and it doesn't end well for them. It was a blunder of generalship on an epic scale. Or perhaps you consider the men who waded ashore through machine gun fire and artillery at Omaha Beach, or in the Pacific at Tarawa, or countless other similar episodes. Or maybe you're thinking of a fictional rendition of this moment. And the one that popped into my mind was Gary Cooper as Marshall Kane, standing on Main Street all alone, waiting for the band of outlaws to come at high noon, promising to kill him. We romanticize that, we marvel at that, largely because we don't know what we ourselves would do if faced with such mortal danger. We might think we know what we would do, but we actually don't. Nobody does. Nobody knows what they would do if they were facing a high degree of certainty of death. So we honor those who do their duty and fulfill their purpose and protect others when in similar situations. But unlike the soldiers that we just mentioned, or even Gary Cooper, I guess he knew because he knew the script, Jesus knew he would not just face toil and pain and danger in Jerusalem. He knew he was going to die there. It was a certainty, not a probability. Charging the enemy position, there is a high probability that you will be injured or killed, but there's not certainty. Not likelihood, not anything more than likelihood, but for Jesus it was certainty. And his determination is all the more remarkable for the fact that we know he knew exactly what was coming. Those not part of Jesus' inner circle were afraid. Now, we don't know how much they knew of Jesus' previous predictions. I imagine the disciples talked about it. I mean, that's big news, Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. He may have told them privately, but I would imagine they at least have an inkling that something is coming. But they're a step removed from that information. Jesus is focusing that on the disciples. So it's little wonder that they fear the coming confrontation in Jerusalem. One of the most terrifying things is the unknown, that which you don't see, that which you don't know. That's one of the reasons why in one of the scariest movies ever made, in Jaws, you never see the shark. Now, one of the other reasons is because Spielberg couldn't get his mechanical shark to work properly, so they didn't have a choice, but it actually was genius because not seeing it was scarier than seeing it. Plus that score, yikes. When we don't know, when we don't understand, when we can't comprehend the will of God for our lives, where am I going? What am I supposed to be doing? When that is the state that we are in, it tests our faith. Especially when the road ahead appears dangerous, ominous, threatening. So yeah, they were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. The remedy of Jesus, the wonder of his disciples, the fear of his followers, his remedy to that is a third dose of knowledge, to tell them a third time what is coming. Each time Jesus predicts his death, he does so privately to his disciples. I think that's partly because this idea is so radical and so difficult to comprehend that those not that close to him would be completely confused, dismayed by these words. Here we see Jesus keeping on trying to share this wisdom of the Father's plan, even if only partial understanding is possible. To me, at least, it's comforting to know that God continued to work with the disciples, reassuring them with repeated explanations 3 times, even though, truth be told, they have no real active role to play in Jesus' passion. He's going alone. We know that. He knows that. And yet he demonstrates the compassion of God, because the primary thing to be achieved by telling them again and again is their comfort, their peace of mind, their anxiety relieved. It reminds us that God cares about us as people, cares about our emotions, cares about our fears and anxieties. We're not simply instruments working to fulfill his will. We're human beings, and he cares about that. Jesus loved these men, and he cared about their state of mind, even though he knew that not one of them would walk out of that Garden of Gethsemane with him. He cared about them enough to make sure that he continued to try to explain this to them. So here he goes again. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law." In my mind, I picture Jesus emphasizing the word "are" in that first phrase. We are going up to Jerusalem. This journey is not optional. It cannot be delayed. It has to happen in conjunction with Passover, so it has to be now. And it is going to happen. This is the climax of Jesus' life. This was always where his journey was heading. The incarnation would not have happened without this ending of his story. Any lesser mission, if God was trying to do anything less than what Jesus was here to do, it would have been fulfilled by the Spirit of God working in and through righteous men and women, as he had done in the past with prophets and leaders and others that he had called and given a mission to. Jesus is here for this purpose. This was why the Son of Man came in the flesh. This is why we have Christmas. This is why we have the incarnation. So yes, we are going to Jerusalem. Notice what's going to happen when he gets there. It's a lasting testament to the depth of human depravity and our utter inability to help save ourselves. That those leading the charge to murder Jesus will be the religious leaders of the very nation called by God to be his covenant people. Those whom God has reached out to the most, has built the greatest connection with, has worked with for generation after generation, has blessed abundantly since the time of Abraham. They are the very people who will despise Jesus the most and work the hardest to kill him. That says something about humanity, and it's not a good thing. Whoa. Sorry, that was a bee in my hair. Where'd you come from? I didn't get stung, at least. All right, distractions. What will they do? They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. Well, we just saw the status of those closest to God, at least in their minds. Those further from the knowledge of God are not going to hesitate to join in once they decide to kill him. Granted, Pilate will be confused about Jesus, and he will be wondering why the Sanhedrin is trying to manipulate him, and he won't like that. But it's not because he actually cares about Jesus' life. He just doesn't like to be a tool of the Sanhedrin. Once they settle things, the Romans will fulfill their role as Jesus' executioners with no moral qualms. None of the soldiers will say, is this the right thing to do? Maybe we shouldn't be doing this. No. They'll look at him as just another rebellious Jew being crucified. We've done this before. We'll do more next week. No big deal. It's fitting that Jesus' trial and execution will be a condemnation of both the religiously pretentious and the religiously disinterested at the same time. Jesus will die for the sins of the world, both Jew and Gentile, both those who think they know God and those who've never heard of him. They will both have a hand in killing the Son of God. While they're at it, they will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. Jesus knew well enough that his coming death would not be quick and it would not be easy. It would be slow and it would be brutal. And he knew that as he led the way to Jerusalem, he knew those details. As much as we think we want to know about our future in detail, we don't actually. You might think you want to know what your life is going to look like next week, next month, next year, next decade, but you actually don't. And I can tell you why. It's better for us to live in the moment, knowing that God has promised where our journey will end, what the final destination is. We know the last chapter, but it is better for us to step one day at a time in that direction. Let the steps in between be a mystery to us. We too must trust the Father to get from here to there. Our path is unlikely to mirror the persecution that Jesus received. But if it does, so be it. Our Heavenly Father holds our souls in his hands safely. We know the end. We don't actually want to know each of the steps along the way. Imagine what it would do to you emotionally if you knew how many days you had left. Exactly how many. Imagine what it would do to you emotionally if you knew this is the last time I'm going to see my wife. This is the last time I'm going to see my kids. This is the last time I'm going to do this and that. Imagine if you carried that burden around. Sure, it wouldn't seem like a problem when that number is 47 years in the future. But as it ticked down, we couldn't handle it. So yeah, we're better off not knowing and trusting in God along the way. And there's where Jesus' conversation ends, and here's a great place to end. 3 days later, he will rise. Just as he emphasized the we are going to Jerusalem, Jesus can emphasize the he will rise. How do I know that how do I know that we're better off with our life in Jesus' hand? Let me start that again. How do I know the end of our story and what it entails? I know because Jesus Christ has already been risen from the grave in victory. He was predicting it now, but to them now, but of course it's history to us. We know that he did rise from the dead. What the Father has done through Jesus, he has promised to do for us in turn. And so we certainly have room to trust. You see, as God, Jesus was not constrained by time. But as the man who he became, in order to save us from our sins, he had to experience each of these moments sequentially, one after another. He knew what lay beyond the cross. He knew that death would not be able to hold on to his righteous life, but he still had to live through it to see the other side. We too know what awaits us on the other side of death's veil. That was that last verse of He Leadeth Me we were singing this morning. We know what is on the other side, and we too must make this journey one step at a time. The question then is, will our faith enable us to lead the way as we follow in Jesus' footsteps. For indeed, faith is the victory that overcomes the world. 3 quick thoughts of application before we finish up here. Number 1, Jesus knew what would happen to him in Jerusalem. He still led the way there. Secondly, trust in the Father's will was essential to Jesus. It is to us too. It's always trust. Lastly, we too then can fulfill our role in the will of God with confidence, knowing what awaits us in the life to come. Dick, if you could let Carrie and Noah to come on back.